In the sterile corridors of Manhattan's most prestigious medical tower, a single father in worn janitor's uniform held the life of a billion-dollar CEO in his calloused hands. Marcus Thompson, invisible to the world that walked past him every day, had 30 seconds to save the woman who would soon utter words that would shatter his faith in humanity forever. She wouldn't say thank you. She wouldn't acknowledge his heroism. Instead, her first conscious words would cut deeper than any blade, revealing the cruel truth about how society views those who serve in silence. What followed wasn't just a story of survival. It was a reckoning. A quiet man with hidden depths would face a choice that would expose the darkness lurking beneath America's glittering surface of success. Marcus Thompson moved through the gleaming halls of Meridian Tower like a ghost at 5:47 a.m., his sneakers making barely a whisper against the marble floors. At 34, his sandy blonde hair was already showing premiums of silver, cut practical and short to stay out of his way during 16-hour shifts. His uniform bore the faded logo of Elite Facility Services, but there was nothing elite about the way the corporate world treated him. To the executives rushing past him with their designer coffee and urgent phone calls, Marcus was furniture, a fixture, something to step around while discussing million-dollar deals and weekend yacht trips. They never noticed the careful way he moved, never saw how his green eyes tracked every detail of their conversations, cataloging information with the precision of someone trained to see what others missed. In his back pocket, folded with military precision, Marcus carried a photograph that told a different story. 8-year-old Emma Thompson grinned at the camera, missing 2 front teeth, clutching a blue ribbon from her school's science fair. "My daddy's the smartest," was written in purple crayon across the bottom. It was the only thing that mattered in his world, the only thing that kept him moving through 18 months of invisible labor in a building where his presence was acknowledged only when something needed cleaning. What none of them knew, what Marcus had buried beneath years of quiet service and humble acceptance, was that he once wore a different uniform, one that commanded respect instead of contempt, one that required skills far more complex than operating a mop bucket. Hidden in his small apartment in Queens, wrapped in tissue paper like a sacred relic, lay a medal that told the story of Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, United States Army Special Forces. A man who had saved lives in places where heroism meant the difference between coming home and being forgotten forever. But that was before Sarah died, before the medical bills, before he traded his rank for anonymity, his purpose for survival. Now he was just the janitor, and in the cruel mathematics of social hierarchy, that made him nothing at all. Every morning, Marcus pinned his name tag over the place where his ranger tab once sat. Every evening, he helped Emma with homework that challenged him more than battlefield strategy ever had, not because it was complex, but because it reminded him of dreams that had died with Sarah. His daughter was brilliant, gifted in mathematics and sciences that could open doors Marcus would never walk through again. The photograph in his pocket wasn't just a keepsake. It was evidence that someone in this world still saw him as more than the sum of his circumstances. Emma looked at him like he was still Lieutenant Thompson, still the man who could fix anything, solve any problem, handle any crisis. She didn't need to know that her hero spent his days invisible to people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the situations he'd navigated with expertise. But invisibility had its advantages. People spoke freely around furniture. They revealed their true nature when they thought no one important was listening. And Marcus had learned that the wealthy weren't just indifferent to suffering, they were often entertained by it. The metal of Marcus's cart rattled softly as he approached the 47th floor executive suite. The same rhythm that once accompanied his gear checks in the mountains of Afghanistan. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago, Lieutenant Marcus Thompson had been leading a reconnaissance mission outside Kandahar when the call came through. Emergency leave approved. Get home now. Sarah had been fighting stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 8 months, but she'd hidden the worst of it from him. The Army Wives Network was supposed to provide support, but medical bills had a way of consuming everything. Savings, hope, and eventually, choices. When Marcus returned to Walter Reed Medical Center in his dress blues, expecting to find his wife recovering, he instead found her in a bed that cost more per day than his monthly salary. "I need you to promise me something," Sarah had whispered, her wedding ring sliding loose on fingers that had grown too thin. Emma, only 6 then, was asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair, using Marcus's jacket as a blanket. "Don't let what happens to me change who you are," Don't let them make you small. The promises came easy in the sterile quiet of that room. The reality of keeping them proved impossible. After the funeral, the bills continued arriving like personal attacks. The Army's life insurance covered the basics, but specialized treatments, experimental medications, and months of around-the-clock care had created a mountain of debt that demanded sacrifices. Emma needed stability, needed a father who could be present instead of deployed. The choice between service to country and service to daughter wasn't really a choice at all. Marcus had tried to transition his military skills into civilian security, but every position required extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and months of waiting that he couldn't afford. When Emma started asking why they had to move from their base housing to a cramped apartment in Queens, when she stopped inviting friends over because she was embarrassed by the peeling paint and broken air conditioner, Marcus took the first job that offered immediate pay and asked no questions about his past. Elite Facility Services hired him on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, he was mopping the floors of the same building where defense contractors made millions on projects he'd once briefed Pentagon officials about. The irony was suffocating, but Emma needed school clothes, and the apartment needed groceries. Dignity became a luxury he couldn't afford. Every morning, Marcus pinned his name tag over the place where his Ranger tab once sat. Every evening, he helped Emma with homework that challenged him more than battlefield strategy ever had. Not because it was complex, but because it reminded him of dreams that had died with Sarah. His daughter was brilliant, gifted in mathematics and sciences that could open doors Marcus would never walk through again. The photograph in his pocket wasn't just a keepsake. It was evidence that someone in this world still saw him as more than the sum of his circumstances. Emma looked at him like he was still Lieutenant Thompson, still the man who could fix anything, solve any problem, handle any crisis. She didn't need to know that her hero spent his days invisible to people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the situations he'd navigated with expertise. But invisibility had its advantages. People spoke freely around furniture. They revealed their true nature when they thought no one important was listening. The humiliations started small, the way forest fires begin with single sparks. Victoria Sterling, the 43-year-old CEO of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, had built her reputation on ice-cold efficiency and zero tolerance for what she called mediocrity masquerading as effort. Her corner office on the 48th floor was a shrine to ruthless success. Awards for Businesswoman of the Year, photographs with senators and foreign ministers, and a wall of patents that had generated billions in revenue. Marcus first encountered her disdain on a Tuesday morning in October, when her assistant called maintenance about the cleaning person who leaves streaks on the conference room windows. He'd arrived to find Victoria in the middle of a board meeting, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon, her gray eyes cutting through projected quarterly reports like surgical instruments. "Excuse me," she'd said, without looking up from her presentation, her voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Could you come back when adults are working? This isn't daycare." The 12 board members had chuckled appropriately. Marcus had nodded, gathered his supplies, and left without a word. But something in her tone, something in the casual cruelty of dismissing him as less than adult, had lodged itself in his chest like shrapnel. The pattern escalated over the following weeks. Victoria Sterling seemed to view his presence as a personal affront to her carefully constructed world of power and privilege. She began timing his appearances, critiquing his work with the precision she applied to corporate acquisitions. "The baseboards in the executive bathroom aren't acceptable," she'd inform her assistant loudly enough for Marcus to hear. "Either find someone competent, or I'll find a service that employs people who understand what thoroughness means." What made it worse was the audience she cultivated for these performances. Junior executives, eager to curry favor, would echo her sentiments with theatrical disgust. "It's so hard to find decent help these days," they'd commiserate, as if Marcus weren't standing 6 feet away, methodically cleaning surfaces that reflected their privileged faces back at them. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in November, when Marcus was emptying wastebaskets in the executive conference room after a late merger meeting. Victoria Sterling had remained behind, reviewing contracts at the mahogany table that cost more than Marcus's annual salary. "Tell me," she'd said without looking up, her Mont Blanc pen making notes in margins that would affect thousands of jobs. "Do you have children?" The question surprised him. In 18 months of invisible labor, no executive had shown even cursory interest in his personal life. Yes, ma'am. A daughter. How old? 8. Victoria had finally looked up then, her expression suggesting she was solving a particularly interesting puzzle. And what do you tell her when she asks what Daddy does for work? When her little friends ask why her father empties trash cans for a living? The cruelty in the question wasn't accidental. It was precisely calibrated to inflict maximum psychological damage. And Marcus felt it hit its target with devastating accuracy. I tell her I work hard to take care of her. How noble, Victoria had smiled. But the expression held no warmth. And when she grows up and realizes that hard work without intelligence or ambition is just this, she gestured dismissively at his cart, his uniform, his existence. Will you tell her that some people are meant for service, while others are meant to be served? It might save her the disappointment of thinking she deserves more than her genetics can deliver. Marcus had finished emptying the wastebasket in silence, but his hands had trembled slightly as he worked, not from fear or weakness, but from the tremendous effort required to remain silent when every instinct screamed for him to respond. This woman, who'd never faced a day of genuine hardship in her manicured existence, was lecturing him about disappointment, about genetics, about what people deserved. The following Monday brought new depths of humiliation. Victoria had apparently shared her assessment of his character with the executive staff, because their treatment of him shifted from indifference to active contempt. They began leaving messes deliberately, coffee spilled on conference tables, papers scattered across floors, sticky notes with clean better affixed to surfaces he'd already sanitized. During a morning staff meeting that he was cleaning around, Marcus overheard Victoria explaining her management philosophy to a group of new hires. Excellence trickles down from leadership, she'd said, her voice carrying clearly across the conference room. When you accept substandard performance from anyone, even the most insignificant employees, you communicate that mediocrity is acceptable. That's why I maintain standards for everyone in this building, regardless of their limitations. Her eyes had found Marcus as she spoke the final word, making clear that he was the example of limitations she referenced. The new hires had nodded sagely, absorbing this wisdom about maintaining standards and not accepting mediocrity from insignificant people like the man cleaning their workspace. But the cruelest moment came 3 weeks later, when Marcus was working late to finish floor maintenance before Emma's school play. He'd promised her he'd be there, that nothing would make him miss watching her perform the role of Marie Curie in the school's Women in Science production. She'd been practicing her lines for months, explaining radioactivity with the same intensity she brought to everything she loved. Victoria Sterling had remained in her office past normal hours, preparing for a morning presentation to Japanese investors. As Marcus worked in the hallway outside her door, she'd emerged with a stack of documents and a look of profound irritation. "You're still here," she'd observed, as if his presence were a violation of natural law. "Yes, ma'am. Just finishing up." "Well, finish faster. Some of us have important work to do, and the sound of your activities is distracting." She'd paused, studying him with the clinical detachment of an entomologist examining a particularly uninteresting specimen. "Tell me, do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you'd made better choices? If you'd applied yourself when it mattered?" Marcus had kept working, but something in his controlled silence must have frustrated her, because she'd pressed harder. "I mean, surely you didn't plan for this to be your legacy, spending your prime years invisible to people who matter, leaving no mark on the world beyond clean floors and empty wastebaskets. When you die, will anyone remember you existed? Will your daughter tell her children about her grandfather, the janitor?" The questions hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into wounds that had never fully healed. December arrived in New York, with the kind of bitter cold that made Marcus's early morning commute feel like a punishment for surviving another day. Emma had been asking questions he couldn't answer. Why they couldn't afford the science camp her teacher recommended. Why Daddy looked so tired all the time. Why their Christmas tree this year was smaller than last year's. Her 8-year-old logic was ruthless in its clarity. If Daddy was working so much, why didn't they have more money? The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning, when Marcus arrived at Meridian Tower to find a note taped to his cart. "Janitor, your work yesterday was unacceptable. Conference Room C hasn't been properly sanitized. Do better or find another job. -V.S." The handwriting was Victoria Sterling's, each letter formed with the precision of someone who'd never been told no. Marcus stared at conference room C, which he'd spent an extra 30 minutes cleaning the night before, removing every trace of the spilled wine and scattered papers from the executive Christmas party. He'd scrubbed surfaces that were already spotless, organized supplies that were already orderly, and stayed 2 hours past his shift to ensure everything met the standards that seemed to shift higher every time he thought he'd reached them. Standing alone in the pre-dawn darkness of the 47th floor, surrounded by the monuments to other people's success, Marcus felt something break inside him that had been bending for too long. This wasn't living. This was just surviving, and barely at that. Emma deserved better than a father who came home exhausted and defeated, who couldn't afford to nurture her brilliant mind, who was slowly disappearing into the invisible workforce of people who served without being seen. He pulled out his phone and started composing a text to his supervisor. 2 words. I quit. His finger hovered over the send button while traffic began moving in the streets below. Somewhere in Queens, Emma was probably getting ready for school, maybe wondering if Daddy would be home early enough to help with her science project about renewable energy sources. A topic that reminded Marcus painfully of the environmental briefings he used to deliver to military leadership about sustainable forward operating bases. But as he prepared to send the message that would end his employment, and somehow begin the impossible task of finding another job that could support them, his phone buzzed with a text from Emma's teacher. Marcus, Emma's essay about heroes made the whole class cry. She wrote about you. Thought you should know how proud she is. You're raising an amazing kid. The words hit him like a physical blow. Emma still saw him as a hero, despite everything. The cramped apartment, the second-hand clothes, the father who worked 18-hour days and still couldn't afford her dreams. She still believed in him. Maybe Victoria Sterling was right about legacies and being remembered. But maybe she was wrong about who decided what mattered. Marcus deleted the resignation text. He had work to do. At 6:43 a.m. on December 15th, Marcus was sanitizing the executive bathroom on the 48th floor when he heard the thud. It wasn't the usual sound of dropped files or stumbling in high heels that occasionally echoed through the early morning corridors. This was different, heavier, final, like something valuable breaking against marble. He found Victoria Sterling collapsed outside the elevator bank, her designer briefcase scattered open, documents mixing with the spilled contents of her purse. Her face had taken on a grayish pallor that Marcus recognized from battlefield medical training, and her breathing was shallow, irregular. A diabetic medical alert bracelet on her wrist told him everything he needed to know about her current crisis. In the 30 seconds between discovering her unconscious body and the arrival of paramedics he'd already called, Marcus made a series of decisions that drew on skills he'd buried beneath months of invisible labor. He checked her pulse, weak but present, monitored her breathing, compromised but stable, searched her purse with efficient precision until he found what he was looking for: an emergency glucagon injection kit that she'd never had to use herself. His hands, steady despite the circumstances, administered the injection with the same clinical precision he'd once applied to treating wounded soldiers in hostile territory. He positioned her body to maintain airway clearance, monitored her vital signs, and provided exactly the kind of immediate medical intervention that meant the difference between a manageable emergency and permanent brain damage. When Victoria's eyes fluttered open 4 minutes later, before the paramedics arrived, before her assistant discovered the crisis, before anyone with importance knew that Sterling Pharmaceuticals' CEO had nearly died on the marble floors of her own corporate kingdom, she found herself looking into the face of her janitor. Marcus expected confusion, maybe gratitude, perhaps even a moment of human connection that transcended their artificial hierarchy. What he got instead were the first words Victoria Sterling spoke after nearly losing her life to diabetic shock. "Get away from me." Not thank you. Not what happened. Not even basic acknowledgement that he'd potentially saved her life. Just a command, delivered with the same imperious tone she used to critique his cleaning methods, to dismiss his existence, to remind him of his place in her carefully ordered world. "Ma'am, you were unconscious. I administered glucagon and called paramedics. They'll be here shortly." Victoria struggled to sit up, her coordination still compromised, but her social reflexes functioning perfectly. "I said, get away from me. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever angle you're playing, I won't be manipulated by hired help who think one good deed entitles them to special treatment. The words landed like physical blows. Marcus had risked his job by going through her personal belongings to find the medication. He'd used skills that could have revealed his military background, potentially complicating his employment. He'd acted on instinct and training to preserve the life of a woman who had spent months systematically humiliating him, and her first conscious thought was suspicion about his motives. "I'm not playing any angle, ma'am. You needed medical help." "What I need," Victoria said, using the wall to steady herself as she stood on unsteady legs, "is for you to forget this happened. Completely. I don't want gossip about my medical condition spreading through the service staff. I don't want pity, and I certainly don't want anyone thinking that I owe anything to someone like you." The elevator doors opened, and paramedics rushed out with their equipment and professional urgency. As they began their assessment, asking Victoria questions about her medical history and current symptoms, she answered with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to being in control of every situation. She never mentioned Marcus's intervention, never acknowledged his presence, spoke about her collapse as if she'd simply fainted, and recovered on her own. "Sir," one of the paramedics addressed Marcus, "did you witness what happened?" Victoria's eyes met his for the first time since regaining consciousness, and the warning in them was unmistakable. She was giving him a choice: remain invisible and keep his job, or speak truth and face consequences that would extend far beyond this morning. "I found her collapsed and called 911, Marcus said quietly. "That's all." The paramedic nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "Good thinking." Quick response probably prevented serious complications. Victoria said nothing, but her slight nod toward Marcus communicated grudging approval for his discretion. As the medical team prepared to transport her for further evaluation, she gathered her scattered documents with hands that still trembled slightly from her blood sugar crisis. When she passed Marcus on her way to the elevator, she paused just long enough to speak words, meant for his ears only. "This changes nothing between us. If anything, it proves my point about people who can't recognize boundaries. Don't mistake a medical emergency for an opportunity to overstep your position." The elevator doors closed on Victoria Sterling being attended to by medical professionals, leaving Marcus alone in the corridor with his cart, his cleaning supplies, and the devastating realization that some people were incapable of recognizing humanity even when it saved their lives. But something had shifted in that corridor, something that wouldn't be sanitized away with industrial cleaning products. Marcus had remembered who he was before he became invisible, and remembering, he realized, was the first step toward reclaiming it. The transformation began quietly, the way all meaningful changes do. Marcus didn't announce his decision or make dramatic proclamations. He simply started carrying himself differently. The man who had once led soldiers through hostile territory, who had made split-second decisions that saved lives, who had earned the respect of superior officers through competence and character, began to emerge from beneath the uniform of invisible servitude. 3 days later, Victoria Sterling returned to Meridian Tower with the kind of determined normalcy that wealthy people use to pretend vulnerability never happened. She made no reference to her medical emergency, issued no acknowledgement of life-saving intervention, and resumed her pattern of treating Marcus like sentient furniture that occasionally required criticism. But something had changed in the building's social ecosystem. Word had spread among the executive staff about the janitor who'd handled the CEO's crisis with quiet competence, who'd maintained discretion when gossip could have been profitable, who demonstrated the kind of grace under pressure that their leadership seminars talked about, but rarely produced. Marcus noticed the change in small gestures. Executives who nodded when he passed, assistants who said please when requesting additional cleaning, a general softening of the casual cruelty that had defined his employment. Not everyone had learned Victoria's lesson about humanity transcending hierarchy, but enough people had witnessed genuine character to shift the building's atmosphere. It was during the company's annual board meeting, with investors and media present, that the moment of truth arrived. Victoria was delivering her year-end presentation, discussing the pharmaceutical breakthroughs that had generated record profits, when she suffered another diabetic episode. This time, there were witnesses, important witnesses, board members, journalists, potential investors who had flown in from around the world to assess Sterling Pharmaceuticals' stability and leadership. As Victoria's words slurred and her composure cracked, as her body betrayed her in front of the people whose opinions determined her professional survival, Panic rippled through the boardroom. Executives fumbled for their phones. Assistants froze in uncertainty, and the carefully orchestrated presentation dissolved into chaos. But Marcus Thompson didn't hesitate. In full view of the assembled power brokers and media representatives, he moved with the calm efficiency of someone trained to handle emergencies. He administered the glucagon injection with steady hands while explaining to the paralyzed audience what was happening, how it would be resolved, and why there was no cause for panic. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. His actions displayed the competence of a professional who had faced far more serious crises than a medical emergency in a Manhattan boardroom. As Victoria regained consciousness, as color returned to her face and her breathing stabilized, the boardroom fell into the kind of silence that follows the revelation of unexpected truth. One of the board members, a silver-haired man with decades of corporate experience, approached Marcus with genuine curiosity. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "Where did you learn emergency medical procedures?" Marcus met his gaze steadily, no longer the invisible janitor who deflected attention and avoided confrontation. "United States Army Special Forces, sir. 12 years of service, including multiple combat deployments." The words hit the boardroom like a bomb. Suddenly, every conversation about competence and intelligence and genetic limitations took on a different meaning. The janitor they had dismissed as intellectually inferior was a decorated military veteran. The man they had treated as furniture had commanded soldiers and saved lives in circumstances they couldn't imagine. Victoria Sterling, still weak from her medical crisis, looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed bewilderment with the dawning realization that she had fundamentally misjudged someone she had spent months systematically humiliating. But Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't deliver speeches about assumptions and prejudice. He simply helped ensure she was comfortable, provided the paramedics with detailed information about her condition, and prepared to return to his duties. The transformation in how people treated him was immediate and profound. Executives who had never acknowledged his existence began greeting him by name. Board members asked about his military service with genuine interest. The same people who had participated in Victoria's campaign of casual cruelty suddenly discovered reserves of respect they had never bothered to access before. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. A young intern named David, barely 22 and fresh from college, approached Marcus during his evening rounds. He had been present during the boardroom incident, had watched the dramatic shift in everyone's perception of the quiet janitor who turned out to be a decorated veteran. "Sir," David said with the earnestness of youth, "I wanted to apologize. I never treated you badly, but I never treated you well either. I just ignored you like everyone else. That was wrong." Marcus studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse and something else. The desire to be better than the environment that had shaped his initial attitudes. "You don't need to apologize for not knowing something you were never told," Marcus replied gently. "But maybe think about how you treat people when you don't know their story. Everyone has one." The conversation led to others. David began stopping by during Marcus's shifts, asking about his military experience, his transition to civilian life, the challenges of single parenthood. Other employees, emboldened by David's example, began seeing Marcus as a person rather than a function. They learned about Emma's academic achievements, about Marcus's pride in her scientific curiosity, about the sacrifices he made to ensure her future would be brighter than his present. Victoria Sterling never apologized. She never acknowledged her cruelty or expressed gratitude for the life-saving intervention Marcus had provided twice. But she stopped the active campaign of humiliation, stopped using him as an example of mediocrity and genetic limitations. The silence felt like progress, even if it wasn't redemption. On his final day before Christmas break, Marcus found an envelope taped to his cart with his name written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. Inside, Emma had drawn a picture of a man in a janitor's uniform wearing a cape, with "My Hero Daddy" written in rainbow letters across the top. Below the drawing, in her most careful penmanship, she'd written, "Thank you for working so hard to take care of me. I love you more than all the stars." That afternoon, as Marcus walked through Queens toward their apartment where Emma was waiting to show him her latest science project, he passed a small group of teenagers who were taunting a homeless veteran, asking for change. Without thinking, Marcus stopped, knelt beside the man, and handed him $20 from his grocery money. "Thank you for your service," he said quietly. The teenagers fell silent. The veteran looked up with tears in his eyes, and Marcus realized that kindness was never wasted, even when it wasn't appreciated, even when it wasn't acknowledged, even when it wasn't returned. Some battles are won not with power, but with the quiet dignity of never letting cruelty change who you are. In a world that often mistakes wealth for worth, true heroism doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It simply shows up, does what needs to be done, and asks for nothing in return. Marcus Thompson understood something that Victoria Sterling never would, that a person's value isn't determined by their job title, their bank account, or their position in an artificial hierarchy. It's measured by their character, their compassion, and their willingness to help others even when the help isn't welcomed or acknowledged. If you were him, facing such systematic cruelty after saving someone's life, would you have maintained such grace?